Welcome back to The Basement. I'm Steve Lewis. This week, we begin our look at U.S. pop culture in the year 1965 with the first quarter, January, February, and March. This will pick up roughly where episode 214, U.S. Pop Culture 1964 Part 8, left off. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that over the weekend, I had a chance to join Jake, Riley, and Nate on the Good Timin' podcast. We took on an interesting challenge to come up with the best possible Beach Boys collection using only songs written by group members other than Brian. It was fun and the results were really interesting. You can check it out here on YouTube at the Good Timin' podcast. Now let's get started with 1965. 1965 is an eventful year, and not just for the Beach Boys. So we'll take the first quarter in two parts. Next time, we'll talk about movies, television, news, and the Beach Boys. This time, we'll start coming back up to speed with a look at music. And as 1965 opens, it's stunning how much popular music has changed in the roughly 11 months since the Beatles' U.S. arrival. The Beatles are still clearly leading the way, and much of what happens during the year will be influenced by them. As the year opens, their brand new album, Beatles 65, is flying up the chart. It'll jump from number 98 to number 1 in the second week of January, and will stay at number 1 until March 13th, a total of 9 weeks. During 1965, we'll get a second wave of British imports with groups like Herman's Hermits, the Kinks, and the Yardbirds. Famously, folk music star Bob Dylan will go electric during the year, becoming hugely influential on popular music. We'll get a bunch of new American groups clearly influenced by both the British invasion and Bob Dylan, like the Byrds, the Turtles, and the Lovin' Spoonful. Our old friends the Beach Boys had had a great 1964. As we'll see, they'll have a great 1965 too, both artistically and commercially, with some of their greatest records. Let's begin with a look at the first album chart, January 2nd, 1965. All of the albums in the top 10 had been in the top 10 on the last chart of 1964. The positions have changed a little, but since we already discussed them in detail in episode 214, I'll go over them pretty quickly here. At number 1 is Roustabout by Elvis Presley. At number 2 is Beach Boys Concert. It had been number 1 the last week of 1964 with Roustabout at number 2. This week, the positions have flipped. The Rolling Stones' 12 by 5 was in the last of 4 weeks at number 3. At number 4, and climbing the chart, Disney's soundtrack to Mary Poppins, which will go to number 1 for 13 weeks beginning April 10th. At number 5 is Where Did Our Love Go by the Supremes. It'll go to number 2 for 4 weeks beginning January 16th. The soundtrack to A Hard Day's Night by the Beatles is at number 6. It had entered the top 10 at number 1 back on July 25th, 1964, and stayed there for 13 weeks. It had been in the top 10 ever since. Hard Day's Night will finally drop out of the top 10 on February 6, 1965. Capitol's documentary double album, The Beatles Story, is in the first of what will eventually be 4 weeks at number 7. People by Barbra Streisand is at number 8. It had been number 1 for 5 weeks, beginning October 31st, 1964. The Door is Still Open to My Heart by Dean Martin is at its number 9 peak. And at number 10, the soundtrack for the film My Fair Lady, which will reach number 4 for 2 weeks, beginning February 6th. On the first singles chart of the year, I Feel Fine by the Beatles is still at number 1 for the second of what will ultimately be 3 weeks. At number 2 is Come See About Me by the Supremes. It had been number 1 the week before I Feel Fine and will return to number 1 right after I Feel Fine on January 16th. Mr. Lonely by Bobby Vinton is at number 3. It had been number 1 on December 12th, 1964. She's a Woman, the B-side of I Feel Fine, is in the second of 2 weeks at its number 4 peak. Love Potion number 9 by The Searchers, another British invasion hit, had entered the top 10 this week at number 5 and will peak at number 3 for 2 weeks beginning January 16th. Going Out of My Head by Little Anthony and the Imperials is in the second of 3 weeks at number 6. She's Not There by the Zombies is at number 7. It had gone to number 2 on December 12th. Another new song in the top 10 this week is Amen by the Impressions at number 8. It'll peak at number 7 next week, January 9th. At number 9 is The Jerk by the Larks on its way to number 7 on January 16th. And The Wedding by Julie Rogers has just entered the top 10 and is in the first of 2 weeks at its number 10 peak. Top 10 singles that will come and go during the first quarter include Downtown by Petula Clark. Petula Clark is an English singer with a distinctly more adult-oriented appeal. This is her first U.S. hit, and though there will be plenty of others, it will turn out to be her biggest. It'll go to number 1 for 2 weeks beginning January 23rd. The Name Game by Shirley, Shirley, Bo Burley, Bonana, Fana, Fo Furley, Me, My, Mo Murley, Shirley Ellis will reach number 3 on January 30th and stay there for 2 weeks. Hold On to What You've Got by Joe Tex will go to number 5 for 2 weeks beginning January 30th. How Sweet It Is to Be Loved by You by Marvin Gaye will go to number 6 on January 30th. It's the beginning of a good year for Marvin Gaye, starting with this, his second ever top 10 hit. Del Shannon sounds decidedly English on his new hit, Keep Searchin' Will Follow the Sun. It'll go to number 9 on January 30th. Also hitting big, You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers. The Righteous Brothers, Bill Medley and Bobby Hatfield, had already been around for a couple of years on Moonglow Records. Since September '64, they'd been regularly featured on ABC's weekly music series Shindig. This was their first release on Phil Spector and Lester Sill's Phyllis label. As you can see, it was produced by Spector and written by Spector, Barry Mann, and Cynthia Weil, so they were in very good hands. You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' will follow Downtown into the number 1 spot for 2 weeks beginning February 6th. As we'll see, this is the beginning of a great year for the Righteous Brothers. Part of a second wave of the British invasion, the Kinks' first U.S. hit, All Day and All of the Night, will go to number 7 for 3 weeks beginning February 6th. Another of America's answers to the Beatles, Gary Lewis and the Playboys, will also have a great year in '65, starting with This Diamond Ring, their first hit, and as it'll turn out, their only number 1. It'll top the chart for 2 weeks beginning February 20th. They'll perform the song on the March 31st edition of The Ed Sullivan Show. Of course, the first thing everyone will tell you about the group is that drummer and frontman Gary Lewis is the son of comedian Jerry Lewis. The English duo of Peter Asher and Gordon Waller will have a second American top 10 with I Go to Pieces, written by Del Shannon. It'll spend 2 weeks at number 9 beginning February 20th. Tell Her No by the Zombies is some more wild-sounding new music from England with some really beautiful changes in the verses. It'll hit number 6 for 2 weeks beginning February 27th. As discussed when we talked about 1964, Sam Cooke had died on December 11th. His posthumous hit Shake will be his last top 10 single. It'll reach number 7 on February 27th. The Adlibs' Boy from New York City will go to number 8 on February 27th. My Girl, The Temptations' first top 10 hit, will go all the way to number 1 on March 6th. The Jolly Green Giant, a novelty hit based on television commercials for Green Giant brand canned vegetables, will hit number 4 for the Kingsmen on March 6th. Hurt So Bad by Little Anthony and the Imperials followed up on Going Out of My Head with another single in their new, more mature style. Hurt So Bad will go to number 10 on March 13th. Ferry Cross the Mersey by Jerry and the Pacemakers will go to number 6 for 2 weeks beginning March 20th. It'll turn out to be their last time in the U.S. top 10. In addition to the chart-topping Beatles 65 already mentioned, other notable late 1964 album releases reaching their chart peak in the first quarter of 1965 include the original cast recording of Fiddler on the Roof, which will go to number 7 on January 30th, and Coast to Coast by the Dave Clark 5, which will go to number 6 on February 27th. Among notable new album releases in the quarter, the Righteous Brothers' You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' album is released in January. America will really discover the Righteous Brothers early in 1965. The album will spend 4 weeks at number 4 beginning February 27th. As mentioned, they'd been recording for Moonglow Records for a couple of years, so they already had a back catalog to exploit for follow-up hits. In the album's second week at number 4, March 6th, their 1963 album, Right Now, and their 1964 release, Some Blue-Eyed Soul, will go to number 11 and number 14, respectively. Each album will hold those positions for 2 weeks. Other notable January releases include Dear Heart and Other Great Songs of Love by Jack Jones, which will go to number 11 on March 20th, and Dear Heart and Other Songs About Love by Henry Mancini, which will go to number 11 on April 3rd. It's 2 of 3 albums featuring the song Dear Heart as a title track that will go top 15 in early 1965. And in January, we get The Best of Al Hirt, which will go to number 13 on April 10th, Blue Midnight by Bert Kaempfert and his orchestra, The Return of Roger Miller, which will go to number 4 for the last 2 weeks of April, and Love by Nat King Cole. On February 15th, 1965, shortly after the album's release, Cole will pass away from lung cancer at the age of 45. Released on February 2nd is Dean Martin Hits Again, which will reach number 13 on April 17th. Released on February 13th, The Rolling Stones Now. It'll go to number 5 for 2 weeks, beginning April 24th. And in other Rolling Stones related news, drummer Charlie Watts' illustrated slim volume book, Ode to a High-Flying Bird, his tribute to jazz great Charlie Parker, was published on January 17th. Also released on February 13th is Introducing Herman's Hermits. Other February releases include Ferry Cross the Mersey by Jerry and the Pacemakers, the soundtrack to their new movie. At number 13, it'll be their biggest U.S. album and near the end of their run as a U.S. chart presence. It'll hit its chart peak on May 15th. Also released in February, Red Roses for a Blue Lady by Vic Dana. The hit single of the same name will help the album reach number 13 on May 29th. Released on March 1st is Girl Happy by Elvis Presley, which will reach number 8 for 2 weeks beginning June 12th. And on March 2nd comes the release of the soundtrack to the new motion picture, The Sound of Music. And released on March 8th, the Beach Boys' new album, Beach Boys Today. Much more to come about this, of course, beginning in a couple of weeks. On March 22nd comes Bob Dylan's new album, Bringing It All Back Home. Dylan's 5th album is a real departure, incorporating a band and electric instruments. It's much closer to rock or electric blues than folk, but it isn't any kind of rock we've ever heard before either. Many of the songs are big and lyrically dense, with introspective, obscure, sometimes surreal words that suggest a feeling or attitude rather than spelling anything out. Some folk fans are outraged. Many find it undeniably good and actually more accessible than his earlier work. Though he'd been celebrated as a folk sensation for a couple of years already, beginning with this album, Dylan will become hugely influential on rock music, with many artists covering his songs and being influenced by his style. It'll take until the fall, but this will eventually become Dylan's first top 10 album. A new wave of British groups is already coming in, and one of the groups leading the way is the Kinks. Their second U.S. album, Kinks Size, is released on March 24th. It'll reach number 13. As we'll see, their introduction to the U.S. market will be anything but smooth. Though they'll remain a presence on U.S. radio and in the American charts, the Kinks won't place another original album higher in the U.S. chart until 1979. Also released in March, A Song Will Rise by Peter, Paul, and Mary, which will spend 3 weeks at number 8 beginning May 22nd, and Dear Heart by Andy Williams. On February 11th, Ringo Starr marries Maureen Cox in London, leaving Paul and George as the only single Beatles. The Beatles spend most of late February through mid-May filming and recording songs for their next movie, which will be in color and titled 8 Arms to Hold You. And that'll do it for this week. Please join me next week when we'll wrap up the first quarter of 1965 with television, movies, news, and the Beach Boys, before launching into a deep dive discussion of the Beach Boys today. Meantime, I look forward to your comments and feedback as always. Please hit like if you don't mind and subscribe if you haven't. Have a great week. Bye.